Aunts and uncles and cousins are very important in a child's life. I remember my aunts. My mother had 4 sisters and 5 brothers. There were 10 of them. And when they would get together, oh my goodness, there was so much chatter, talking about this and talking about that, and we just loved it. But my mother and her sisters got together more often than she did with her brothers. Now, she would get together, they would all come together quite frequently, especially during the holidays. But my mother and her sisters would come together more often. I guess that's the way sisters are. And they would do things with us, and they would take us places, and they would share their credit card. Now, it's very interesting. I told all of you that my mother had 5 children. She and my father, and of course, times got hard sometimes. And I remember that my Aunt Nazarene would give my mother her Hahn's shoe store card. If you know anything about Washington, D.C., you know Hahn's shoe store. She would give her her Hahn's card around school time, and my mother would go down to Hahn's shoe store and get our school shoes. And they would do that. They would share their credit cards. They would share their money with one another to make certain that we had clothes and things that we needed to have. And it was just a wonderful relationship. And sometimes we would go over to their homes and spend the night and play with our cousins. And it was just so wonderful. And I really think that cousins really are your first friends outside of your immediate house and your family. And we would enjoy them. My aunts and my mother would plan picnics for us. Do families still go on picnics? I don't know if families still go on picnics. I know we used to have picnics for the 4th of July and other times, but my mother and her sisters would just pick up and have picnics at any time. And my cousins, sometimes we would go down to the Speedway in Washington. Sometimes we would go to the zoo. Sometimes when our churches would get together, we would go to the beach, Cars Beach, Sparrows Beach, and just have such a good time. And most of the time, my aunts, of course, they were young. I didn't realize they were young. But now that I look back on it, they were in their 30s and their early 40s, and they would get together. The times they would come over my mother's house. I was the oldest. Of course, I told you that. You know, I'm the oldest child. So I would have to help my mother entertain my aunts. Now, when I say entertain, they would always have food whenever you went to one another's house. They had food. So my mother had to prepare food for them. And so I would be the one in the kitchen to bring the food and put it on the table. My mother would sit in there with her sisters, and I guess I would be like the servant. And I would, whatever they wanted, something, if they wanted water, if they wanted hot sauce, whatever they wanted out of the kitchen, I would be the gopher. I guess I may have been about 11 or 12 years old. Well, I know I had the opportunity to leave the kitchen and go on back in my room or do what I wanted to do, but I would sit there in the kitchen while they were in the dining room talking, because I found that they were so fascinating. They were good-looking women, you know. My mother and her sisters were good-looking women, and they were involved women. And they would just talk about this and talk about that. They would talk about what's going on in the news. They would talk about one another, what this one did on her job and what that one did and what this one was going to apply for a job and things at church. I mean, they would just talk, talk, talk. I found it so fascinating. And they never knew I was sitting there in the kitchen. Of course, I didn't let them know. I didn't sit right in the door. I sat over a bit so they wouldn't even know I was in there listening. And you know what? Young people can learn a lot from older people. Now, of course, as I got older, my aunts were getting older. But if I were 11 or 12 years old, they were, as I said, in their 30s, sometimes in their early 40s. But when they got to be in their 70s, they were still getting together at one another's home. And by that time, I could care less about sitting and listening to them. But I learned so much richness as I sat in the kitchen during those early years, in my teenage years too, listening to my aunts, because I was gaining vicarious experiences. I hadn't at that age gone through a lot of the experiences that they were talking about, but I felt like I was involved, that I was going through those things in my head. So it was almost as if they were telling stories to one another, and I had benefit of those stories as learning experiences, and I just loved it. Oh my goodness. All of my aunts are gone now. My mother and my aunts are gone now. But I have pleasant memories of just sitting in the kitchen when they would come over to my mother's house and listen to what they would, they laughed. They had wonderful laughs. Oh, they would laugh and they would talk about this and talk about that. And I was sitting there learning all I could from those who were older, learning from my elders who are now ancestors. And I would only hope that the young children in my family are listening to my sisters and I for what we have to say, because there's so much to be learned by listening to your elders.